This video is kind of our next step in Beyond the Beat and the mixing process. And it's going to focus on EQ. Now, this particular one is going to go into what equalization is, the different type of EQs, and I'll do a little bit of demo on the track, but really this is going to be more definitions and things like that. So, EQ is one of those things that it is so used, it's so important, but it's not as obvious and sexy as far as the mixing process goes as delays and reverbs and phasing and all that kind of effects and whatnot. It is an incredibly important component in sculpting and making things sound professional and ready to be released. This is an old image that I found from an old mixing book, and I think that it demonstrates a concept of mixing, both in terms of panning, by the way, like look, the hi-hat over to the left, a synth balanced, with another keys, thing like that. But it also illustrates EQ in the sense that you have all of these sounds that are related, like the 808, the bass, the kick, and how do you actually make them sit in their own bubble and have presence, whether it seems to be more up front or more below or above. And that is reached through a variety of things, including compression, volume balance, but EQ is right in there. So what is equalization? It is a process of, I do like to say, sonically sculpting. Every sound has a sonic quality that you want to accentuate. And you do that through a process of boosting or cutting the amplitude of certain frequencies. And remember, this goes back a while, but amplitude, essentially kind of the volume, but amplitude is measured in decibels or dB, and frequency is measured in hertz or Hz. And we use EQ to accentuate the sounds that we want to hear, and we cut sounds that we don't want to hear in particular instruments. And adding is called additive EQ, while cutting is called subtractive EQ. And when we're first starting out, we tend to add a lot because we can hear it better. But oftentimes what is more important is actually the subtractive EQ. And hopefully I'll get to that in a clear way. So we also defined that audio is essentially the vibration of particles in the air, waves. And frequency is how often those particles vibrate per second, essentially the cycles. So a low frequency sound, like this image, the red image here, is going to each cycle is going to take longer to create than a high frequency sound. The higher the frequency, the more vibrations. The lower the frequency, the fewer vibrations. Frequency and pitch are directly related, and that's where your ear comes in, is that you need to develop the ability to hear frequencies and the ones that you want to cut or add and things like that. And it's related to pitch in that when you're tuning a guitar or playing a guitar or any other instrument for that matter, you want to be able to hear the right notes. And that we talk about perfect pitch, being able to hear notes and name them, or at least kind of identify where more or less they are. Now, pitch is a musical term referring to the tone of a note. But it is frequency. So the higher the pitch, the higher the frequency. The higher the frequency, the higher the pitch. I always say this one, audio fun fact: when you're tuning your guitar, or when you're playing A above middle C on a piano, or tuning the open A on your guitar, that is 440 hertz. So, if you're flat, it's going to be below that. If you're sharp, it's going to be above that. Graphically, EQ is represented by an XY axis. The x-axis is frequency and the y-axis is amplitude, plus or minus. Another fun fact, human hearing supposedly is from 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz or 20,000 hertz. But as you age, the higher end typically starts to degrade a bit. And, I used to play a frequency generator in class sometimes and annoy kids because I could set it to about 17 or 18,000 hertz and I couldn't hear it. But kids would cover their ears because it was so high pitched and annoying. I love doing that. I miss it. So we'll come back to this XY axis because the EQ3 in Pro Tools is very much, and most, graphical interface EQs in DAWs are like that. So the three main parameters when we're dealing with equalization are, as I already mentioned, amplitude, the plus or the minus in gain, frequency, the pitch from low, mid, or high, and then bandwidth, often referred to on these units as Q, which is the range of surrounding frequencies that get affected when you add or subtract in a frequency range. So you can see in this image, a narrow bandwidth could be as tight as a needle, while a wide bandwidth looks more like, a speed bump. But with that speed bump, if your main frequency is about 5,000 hertz, you're also bringing up 1,000 and you're also bringing up a little bit of 10,000, which is not very surgical. But in this one, you're just dipping 400 and barely touching anything else around it. So both can be useful, but those are the three parameters: amplitude, frequency, bandwidth, or Q. Different types of EQs. A graphic EQ, like this image, is a bunch of faders or sliders that are at pre-established frequencies. When they're in the middle like this, they are essentially bypassed. And typically, you see these in live sound uses to eliminate feedback of your system. And, you'll kind of push one of these up until you start to hear a ring, or you already hear a ring and you start to hear what pitch is that. And, these are often in 31 different frequencies, and you adjust. This would be the left, or channel 1, and channel 2, the right of your PA system. There is a graphic EQ that comes with some DAWs. I think Pro Tools has one now. I don't use them as much as I do other types of EQs in production and studio stuff. Now, EQs that we do use, and it's important to get to know these icons as well. You have peak EQ, which is essentially a boost or a cut of a frequency range that can be fixed, but also kind of has a fixed bandwidth. You have a shelf EQ that essentially boosts or cuts everything above a particular frequency. You have filters that cut or pass, either eliminate or allow to go on an entire range of EQ, whether it's lows, mids, or highs. These aren't very flexible because essentially it is all or nothing. A filter is filtering it out or letting it go through. Now, parametric, these are kind of the bread and butter of the studio because it gives you control over amplitude, frequency, and bandwidth. Obviously being the most flexible, giving you the most control over the tonality of your sounds. So again, filters cut or pass. They actually are called band pass or band cut, low cut or low pass filters. And they remove entire ranges. One that comes with Pro Tools is the Air Kill EQ, which essentially you can set the frequency of your highs, mids, or lows. And if these are your highs, these are your mids, these are your lows, and you kill your highs and mids, your lows, all you get after that is your mids. And it can create some cool sounds, but it's not the sculpting, so to speak. In fact, let's get in here first. I'm having a hard time running Pro Tools and doing this at the same time. So let's see if that comes back so I don't have to start over. All right. Hopefully it can start up in the background. All right. So additional types. Now we have all of these EQs in the studio. Unfortunately, you don't necessarily have them. This is going to be our one that we use quite a bit. These are both from Universal Audio. They are emulations of older or very respected high-end analog EQs. This is API, and this is a peak EQ. So you see essentially a high frequency range of between 7,000 and 12,000, and you can plus or minus in 2 dB intervals. Your mid frequencies are set at 800 to 3,000, and your lows are from 50 to 400, and again, all in 2 decibel increments up or down. You do have a filter ability, and you have a low pass filter, a high pass filter, and an in or out, meaning that it's on or off. This Ssl emulation is a little bit different in that the highs are a shelf or peak, because you can press this bell button to get a peak. I'll explain that when I get Pro Tools up and running. Hopefully I do. So the high frequencies are shelf or peak. The low frequencies are shelf or peak. And the low mids and the high mids are parametric. So you have your amplitude decibels, that tells you that it's amplitude, your frequency, because you see kilohertz, and your bandwidth, because you see wide or narrow. And then you have the EQ3, which is also has low pass and high pass filters. You have your lows either shelf or peak. You have your highs either shelf or peak, and you have 3 bands of low mids, mids, and high mids, all of which are kind of movable, but it's really cool to have that much control. So let's see, where are we at? All right, so that basically kind of, at least in words, goes over quite a bit. I also have a cheat sheet that I've put together over the years of, where certain sonic elements of sound sources are. In a kick drum, the oomph, the bottom is between 50. I'd actually probably change this, up to about 80 or more, maybe even 100. The hollowness, sometimes like a boxiness, 400 to 600. And then if you want to really get the attack of the beater, you go anywhere from 2.5 upwards. But every sound is different. So I do want to apply a couple of these ideas to the song that we're dealing with. So I have to turn off our group because I want to concentrate on the kick right now. All right. So when I listen to that kick, one, I hear pitch. I think it's in key, actually. But I also hear a fair amount of boxiness, that hollowness, and not a lot of low end. So I bring up the EQ3, and I'm going to change my lows. So again, your lows, your low mids, mids, high mids, and highs. You have your amplitude, your y-axis, plus or minus, and you have your x-axis of frequency. I'm going to change this low band to be a peak. So let's leave it as it is for now, actually. And if I bring up the gain, or I can just come and move this. This is a shelf. Okay, so I've established that it's going to start at 154.5. Everything below it comes up. If I change it to a peak, then you can see that it's kind of moving along. But what is missing, it ultimately becomes parametric, it's not missing, is I have also my bandwidth. So I can have a wide bandwidth or a narrow bandwidth. I'm going to be fairly in between with it. And I'm going to go to about, let's see. Interesting. Okay, so this is another technique in that, and some people will say it's a bad technique, but it is a starting point. Is to boost a frequency and move it around. And what are you really looking for? So, that 60 does give me something, but I really found it around the mid 90s. And I'm just going to duck it because I don't want it to be that aggressive. But hear the difference. Thin, some body to it. Now, something else that I want to get rid of subtractively is somewhere in the mid-range frequency, probably around, maybe 400 to 500. Okay, and another thing that you'll hear is not to EQ in isolation, that you want to do it in the context of what you're listening to. Okay, now, something to be careful about as you're EQing is that I just raised these frequency ranges and the surrounding frequencies by almost 8 dB. Now I cut these by 4, but I raised these. So when you're adding amplitude to a particular frequency range, you're also raising volume. So you got to be careful not to get confused between volume and the EQ that your goals are. But I'm just going to keep going a little bit. I am going to solo just so we can concentrate on what we're hearing, and I'm going to bring up another EQ3, and I'm going to listen to this snare drum type thing. It sounds like a whip, and what I would like to do is give it a little bit more body, so to speak. Cut some of that graininess. See? A little less. Now, I'm also going to use the high-pass filter. Now, the high-pass filter is represented, I grew up with them, they used to be, and they still are, but different brands, different things, called a low cut, and it just makes more sense to me. But what you're doing when you engage this and you raise the frequency, you're cutting everything below this frequency. Now, you can do this at steeper octave curves. And if you think about, okay, this snare drum really has a lot of crack to it. It most likely has very little sonic information below, below higher than that, below 100 or even higher, that is important to it. And the issue with cutting, and often you'll hear people say, put a high pass filter or a low cut filter on everything that doesn't represent that frequency range, because even if you have just a little bit in a number of sounds, you are kind of stacking that particular frequency range in a noisy way that muddies up your mix. And you really want to carve out specifically, I want the bass to have this, the kick drum to have this space. I want the bass to have that space. The snare, especially this particular snare, doesn't need it. All right, so I do think that gave us some more body to the kick, and it actually gave us more body to the snare and a little less of that abrasive snap to it. Okay, let's take a look at this bass. And again, EQ is something that you're going to spend hours going through particular sounds. Okay, in context, I'll solo it so we can hear a little bit better. Now this is not surgical, this is a shelf. Now I could put it into peak. I find 96 to be kind of the meat of it, but I like hearing those lower frequencies with the shelf. Okay, so we're giving ourselves a little bit more bass. Now, the relationship between the kick and the bass, because we're kind of raising the same frequency area, we need to be careful with that because we don't want these to interfere with one another, but we'll get to another technique to help address that another time. Let's go to this high-pitched bass. Let me get to a spot, make sure that it's playing so I don't have to wait for it. So this bass is a duplicate, really. So we have two basses. We have a low one and a high one. So on the high one, I'm just going to have it concentrate. Again, I don't need the low end from this. It doesn't have much. So if I cut it, I'll just allow it to kind of have that the higher pitched part of it accentuated, so we get that feel from it without any additional cloudiness. And I'll even go steep on it. So I don't know if you hear it, but I do. When I bypass the EQ on the high one, you actually, in a way, get more bass. You just get more clarity for this one to pop through. So let's listen to all of our basses. Okay. So I'm not going to spend too much more time on it right now, but I would go through most of my sounds and start listening for the areas that I want to accentuate and the areas that I want to cut. And some instruments that are going to take some real attention are all of these pads, because so many of them are doing the same frequency range in terms of their the notes that are being played. And I want to be able to hear them. So I want to kind of carve out some space for them, and the vocals. But we'll address those in a later date.